project management unit and the SAP development team. So this is kind of the next step, really. So we saw this slide yesterday, and I understand that there's some confusion, there's some cultural and language issues around goals, objectives, actions, but let's just assume for now that we know what we're talking about here. So goals, top level, we developed those the other day. We then came up with a lot of options, or a lot of ideas and solutions. We then turned those into options. They now need to be turned into objectives in terms of specific, measurable outcomes of the project. And then for each objective, there will then need to be a series, possibly a series of actions. Okay? It's just action planning. And some of the main key action planning components are going to be for the vision. There will be a series of goals. Each of those goals will have a series of objectives. Each of those objectives may have a series of actions. Each of those actions, and maybe the objectives, will have time required for implementation. Each of the actions, maybe the objectives, will have a financing requirement. There's going to be a prioritisation of this, are they high, medium or low? And we need to identify who are the stakeholders involved, who are the people that are actually going to be implementing, doing this, and maybe who are the stakeholders that are going to be affected. Indicators of success, based around, particularly around the actions. How can you measure the success of this? And then the uncertainties. What are the things that are going to make this difficult, this particular activity difficult? Okay? I don't think there's anything difficult here. This is just very much a stepwise process. As I said, this is just strategic planning.
One thing here, you have to cut at some level, because you can go down and some actions can be and have a goal and objective. So in order to well, you need to stop somewhere in this process. I mean, you will not be able to go in very big detail.
Yeah.
That's isn't it?
Can
you develop that a bit?
You're not going to be, you can't carry on doing this forever. There's going to be a point where you have to say, okay, we've got enough information here to be able to produce a SAP. As long as you've got the goals, the objectives, and maybe the top level actions, that's going to be enough for the SAP, and there might be then more detail required if you're going to do national action programs. But yeah, this is about being clever again, and making sure the SAP is something that can be implementable without being overly complicated.
A comment that I've been discussing with Martin is that once the causal chain analysis has taken place within the TDA SAP process, perhaps it would be useful to take the output from that causal chain analysis, the leverage points, and take that information to the politicians and to say, look, we are going to put this into our strategic action program. We prioritise them, and the top one we think is very important, but it's going to cost the country of $10 million. Do you think that it is likely that can work its way into a country program, action program, or not? Maybe the system says you must be joking. Or maybe they say, yes, we are already contemplating that, so it's easy, it would be easier to implement it. But the point being that perhaps it would be good at a very early stage in the TDA SAP process to go to the politicians, as I say, with the results of the causal chain analysis, which is basically the identification of the problems and the leverage points, as you've done in the exercises, some information about the possible cost of implementing a certain action. And then that in turn might help decide what the thematic studies should be. Because if you have a kind of an agreement that yes, that's possible, then but then maybe the politicians say that we need more information about that. So then you go away and you do your thematic study and it feeds into the system, and ultimately you know that you're heading in the direction which is more likely to lead to approval.
Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Maybe we'll talk about this tomorrow. We'll maybe talk about it later when you're in countries, and also we'll discuss this tomorrow as well. I personally think it's a very pragmatic approach, because, and it all comes down to, and we'll be talking about this after we do the next section on drafting the SAP. I'll be giving a presentation then on the TDA and SAP development process, and you'll then see about timeframes. And this might be a very clever way of making sure that you can use the limited time you've got to get as close as possible to completing the SAP in time available.
Sí, con respecto a la apreciación de Michael, ¿cuál sería la estrategia para poder hacer esa consulta a los políticos? No sé si podrías darnos algunos ejemplos. La consulta a los políticos que desde ayer estamos indicando se convierte en el punto crítico para lograr la aceptación de estas propuestas, ¿no? Si nos pudieran recomendar algunas estrategias o ponernos algunos ejemplos, ¿no? ¿Y por qué te hago la consulta? Porque yo vengo representando a una comunidad pesquera de uno de los 3 sitios pilotos aquí en el Perú. Nosotros hemos trabajado algunas estrategias políticas a nivel de base. Entonces, tenemos nuestro propio punto de vista. Incluso hoy día nos acompaña Luz Riviera, que es antropóloga. Hace 2 años está apoyándonos en el tema de San Juan de Macorna. Y bueno, la consulta era esa. Si nos podías tú recomendar algunas acciones o poner algunos ejemplos.
I'm not going to do it now. What I will say is, again, this afternoon, when you're in the country groups, consider that question. What could be some strategies? Because frankly, you know what the strategies are going to be in these 2 countries. I haven't got a clue. I don't live here, I have no cultural reference in a sense, or political reference for that matter. And maybe then we can talk about that tomorrow as part of this meeting we have. Is that okay? Yeah, okay. Any more comments? Okay, right. Let's move on then to drafting the SAP. So this is the last step in the SAP process. Putting together the SAP. So here we're going to talk about integration of the component parts of the SAP, some advice in the field, what should the SAP look like, and then steps towards SAP implementation. So you've developed by this time a lot of information. There's going to be a TDA document, there's going to be leverage points, there's a vision statement, there are goals, options and alternatives. You've got all these action plan outputs that have been developed from the previous session. You've got indicators of success. You've got implementation strategies, and you've got legal institutional reforms and investments kind of determined. So you have got a huge body of information, and somehow now you have to then synthesize that down into a document that is understandable, applicable to the audience and audiences, because there may be more than one audience. This isn't just about giving it to the Ministry of Finance and saying, you're going to fund this. This is about all the stakeholders. So, all this is exactly the same slide, but with SAP written on it, we talked about yesterday for the TDA. All this information now needs to be integrated into a document. 2 ways of doing it. Again, you can hire a single author, consultant, academic, consultancy group, to pull all the stuff together into one document. Then that then goes to the project manager for review and the project team. Or you can appoint key SAP development team members to draft individual pieces of it under the auspices of the manager, who reports the whole thing back to the project manager, and then it's discussed amongst the SAP development team. Both approaches work, just in the same way as with the TDA. For example, Lake Chad SAP and the Nubian Aquifer SAP. The Lake Chad SAP remarkably was endorsed by the countries. Whether it's implementable is another issue. It's a very, very, very difficult project there because of the countries involved. The Nubian Aquifer SAP was written by a single consultant, but is a technical SAP. A technical SAP means it's essentially a document giving all the information that's been developed out of the working groups, but hasn't had any political acceptance to it, and needs then a whole other project, that would require some aspect of another project to get it implemented. Developing key SAP development team members to draft individual chapters, that was done in the Black Sea. In this last SAP that was developed, but that again was technical. It wasn't ever expected to be endorsed in the time available, which is a very it's shameful for that project in a way, because it would have been so important for that to be endorsed, but it wasn't. The Dnipro River Basin and the Rio de la Plata SAP, I should say, TDA, were both done by groups of people put together. And both of those have since been, the Rio de la Plata has definitely been in the process of being endorsed, and so is the Dnipro River Basin. So both processes